Right then, salute me. That's an order. That's what Senator J.D. Vance barked out, right in the middle of Buckingham Palace's courtyard. But the King's Guard there, he didn't lift a finger, didn't even bat an eyelid. What happened next made the whole palace go quiet, and showed the senator quite clearly that this wasn't America. Want to hear how it all played out? First, make sure you're subscribed, and pop a comment down below to tell us where you're tuning in from. Right, let's get on with it. The line of black cars slid through the huge wrought iron gates of Buckingham Palace, neat and tidy like you'd expect for important visitors. The shiny cars reflected the typical London drizzle, that light rain that seems to get everywhere, making the palace look a bit fuzzy, like a picture with a soft filter. Tourists were all along the barriers, phones out, hoping for a peek at whoever was important enough to drive straight into the palace. Then out got Senator J.D. Vance. And get this, he didn't even wait for someone to put up an umbrella. One hand was sorting out his dark coat, the other straightening the little American flag badge on his jacket. He looked around the courtyard with a face that said he wasn't very impressed, like someone watching a school play that wasn't very good. "Remind me why we're treating this like some old-fashioned dress-up game," he muttered to his assistant. This young lad was doing that nervous smile people do when their boss is being a bit awkward in public. You see, they were there with a group of politicians from different parties, meeting top British officials to chat about defense, things happening around the world, all that sort of important stuff. But to Vance, all the fancy bits, the uniforms, the music, the marching felt more like a big show than real government work. A bit behind him, another assistant whispered to a mate, "Oi, careful. Remember what happened last time he kicked off about royal rules in that interview." As the group started walking towards the west courtyard for the official look-around, Vance sped up, his shoes crunching on the gravel like he was doing it on purpose. A palace official started telling them facts about the changing of the guard, but you could tell Vance was barely listening. "You know what doesn't make an army stronger?" he said quietly, just loud enough for the assistant next to him. "Showing off. We've got proper soldiers. What have they got? A parade team in silly outfits." The assistant very wisely said nothing at all. Just ahead, 2 British officers in their smart ceremonial uniforms were waiting to greet the Americans. Vance gave them a quick nod, almost ignoring them, his eyes already drifting to the King's Guard standing far off across the courtyard. Their uniforms were so bright against the grey morning, those famous red coats, the massive bearskin hats, rifles held perfectly still, almost like robots. It was like a bit of history frozen in time. To most folks, it's an amazing sight of discipline and tradition. To Vance, it looked like something from a museum that had somehow ended up with a wage. He breathed out softly, his breath turning to mist in the damp air. Let's just get this silly show over with. The thing was, he had no clue that the moment that would make his whole visit memorable was just about to happen. Over at the far side of the courtyard, Lance Corporal Tom Atkins stood as still as if he'd grown out of the ground, like a statue straight from British Army history. He was wearing that famous King's Guard uniform, red tunic ironed perfectly, with creases sharp enough to give you a paper cut. That tall bearskin hat sat on his head like it weighed nothing, and his white-gloved hands rested on his polished rifle. The chap hadn't moved for over an hour. Not a flicker, not a blink. Nothing. His eyes were fixed ahead, across the palace grounds, his expression impossible to read, completely solid. Even with the soft London drizzle landing on his shoulders, he might as well have been made of stone. To any tourist passing by, he probably looked like a very fancy decoration. But to anyone who knew a bit, this bloke was anything but. You see, Atkins, he's 31, born and bred in Devon, from one of those families where serving in the army goes back for ages, right back to the First World War. He's served in Iraq, been in Estonia for army exercises with NATO. This wasn't just any soldier. He was a true professional, the sort of bloke other soldiers tell stories about. known for his good judgment under pressure and discipline that was almost superhuman. Getting picked for ceremonial duty wasn't some easy gig for being good. He'd earned every bit of it. Behind the ropes, a small group of British veterans was gathering. One of them, a chap in his 60s wearing a dark blazer covered in medals, leaned over to a younger mate. "See that guard? That's Atkins," he said, nodding slightly towards the still figure. "Held his ground during that awful mess near Fallujah. Didn't even flinch when the radios went down and everything went pear-shaped." Around them, tourists were snapping photos like mad. A group of school kids were watching the guards with that mix of wonder and confusion children get, whispering questions to their teacher. Near the back of the crowd, a man stood with an umbrella, looking on quietly and respectfully, the kind of person who sees what's happening and chooses to just watch. Then J.D. Vance saw him. The American senator had stopped halfway across the courtyard, sort of listening to an assistant telling him about their schedule. But something about Atkins caught his eye. Not the uniform, he'd already made fun of that. Not the rifle. It was that completely steady stillness, that total lack of reaction, that seemed to really annoy him. "That fella's not even blinking," Vance muttered, tilting his head like he was looking at something odd at a fun fair. His voice wasn't very loud, but it was loud enough. A few people turned round. One of the British officers doing the tour shifted a bit, like he was about to step in, but then he didn't. Vance slowed down, wandering slightly off the planned route. His eyes stayed fixed on Atkins, like a hunter who's just seen something interesting to aim at. Nobody said a word, but the crowd, especially those veterans, were starting to watch more carefully now. The feeling in the air changed. You could feel it. A quiet tension, but definitely there, building up like static before a thunderstorm. And Lance Corporal Tom Atkins? He stayed exactly as he was, completely unmoved by it all, yet somehow right at the center of it. Vance started walking in a casual, almost smug way as he got closer to Lance Corporal Atkins. His team were lagging behind, clearly not sure if they should follow or just pretend their boss wasn't going off script. The senator had a faint, put-on smile, the kind that barely hid how much he was looking down on things. He started walking around Atkins very slowly, hands behind his back, like someone at a museum looking closely at an exhibit. "Well, this is impressive," Vance said, loud enough for the tourists nearby to hear. "It's like someone wound him up and forgot to press play." A few nervous laughs went through the crowd, but you could see several British onlookers stiffening up. One woman actually put her phone down, her face quickly turning sour. A man in a tweed cap muttered under his breath, "Absolutely disgraceful behavior." But Vance, he was just getting started. "Tell me something," he said to a palace assistant who was hovering nearby. "Does he ever actually move?" The poor assistant blinked, confused, and mumbled something about ceremonial rules. Vance cut him off. "No, seriously. I mean, look at this chap. They tell me he's a combat soldier." He actually chuckled at his own comment. "Looks more like he's trying out for a spot at Madame Tussauds, if you ask me." Behind him, that retired British colonel in the medal-covered blazer narrowed his eyes, but stayed quiet, folding his arms. He knew exactly what game was being played here. Vance wasn't just being rude. He was pushing boundaries, poking at traditions he didn't understand or maybe just didn't care about. Atkins remained completely still, not even a flicker to show he'd heard. Vance took another step closer, now properly crossing that invisible line between visitor and guard, the one every tourist knows you don't cross. His voice dropped a bit, just above a whisper, but still sharp enough to cut through the soft drizzle. "Ever actually been in a proper scrap, Corporal? Or are you just here to look pretty for the tourists?" Still nothing. Not a twitch. Vance's smile got wider. "That uniform can't be comfy, especially that hat. What is that thing anyway? Who designed it? Napoleon's tailor?" More tourists were turning to watch now. One young American couple looked at each other uncomfortably, the wife whispering, "Is he even allowed to get that close?" Her boyfriend just shook his head, looking more and more uneasy. "Look, I get tradition," Vance went on, raising his voice a bit, making sure he had an audience. "But this is what happens when looking good replaces being ready for a fight. You lot dress up discipline in wool and fancy buttons and call it military service." He actually leaned in closer now, making a show of looking at the stitching on Atkins's sleeve. "I bet this thing's a fire hazard too." A ripple went through the watching crowd. Even the school children, sensing something was wrong, had gone quiet. From a distance, one of the palace guides started to step forward, but a senior officer made a quiet gesture for him to stay put. Vance stood right in Atkins's line of sight. Now it was a clear, obvious breach of palace visitor rules. He was too close, too casual, and far too loud. "You know, in the Marine Corps," Vance announced, talking to no one in particular, but making sure everyone could hear, "we train soldiers to adapt, to react to threats, not stand about posing for postcards." Still, Atkins didn't move. Not an inch. The only sound was that gentle London drizzle tapping lightly on stone and cloth. "You're really not going to break character, are you?" Vance said, almost sounding impressed. "All that training, all that practice, just to play statue in the rain." He took one more small step forward. "Come on, mate. Blink, twitch, heck, give me a salute. Something, anything." Atkins stayed perfectly still, and somehow that stillness was starting to feel like its own kind of power, a presence that was stronger than any shouting match could ever be. The retired colonel leaned towards a nearby tourist, murmuring just loud enough, "He's trying to wind up a soldier who's seen more real action than he ever will." But Vance, he couldn't see it, or wouldn't. But everyone else was starting to. A line had definitely been crossed, and that silence, far from being a sign of giving in, was becoming the most powerful answer of all. Now Vance's whole attitude changed. What began as a bit of teasing was turning into something nastier, a show of power, of being more important. He squared his shoulders and stood right in front of Lance Corporal Tom Atkins, completely blocking the guard's view. To anyone who didn't know better, it might have looked like curiosity, but for those who knew palace rules, this was a clear no-no. Guards should never be approached so closely, never have their way blocked, and definitely never on purpose. Yet here was J.D. Vance, inches from a motionless soldier, his face a mix of challenge and command. "I'm J.D. Vance," he announced, louder now, clearly speaking to the gathering crowd as much as to the man in front of him. "United States Senator. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and I've worn the uniform myself." There was a deliberate pause, just long enough for nearby tourists to turn and really watch. "I think a bit of respect is in order, don't you?" Absolute stillness from Atkins. Vance reached up, tapped his lapel pin with 2 fingers, that little American flag catching the light. In the military, the real military, we salute rank. That's not just an American tradition, that's how allies behave. He tilted his head slightly, as if amused by his own boldness. "And since we're allies, Corporal, I think it's time you showed some proper military manners." He gave a short, sharp nod, then said the words like he was giving an order on a battlefield. "Salute me." The air practically crackled with tension. A few genuine gasps came from the crowd. One woman whispered, "He did not just say that." A father quietly pulled his child back behind the rope line, as if they were watching something that might blow up. Atkins didn't move, not a muscle. Vance didn't back down. "I'm giving you a direct order, soldier," he continued, actually pointing now, not quite touching, but close enough to make several onlookers visibly wince. "Salute me, right now." Complete silence. Not even the tourists seemed to be breathing. The guard's fixed gaze remained unbroken. A teenage boy near the back muttered to his friend, "Is this bloke actually serious?" Then Vance made his final big mistake. He stepped even closer, so close that his shoulder actually brushed against the edge of Atkins's rifle. He leaned in slightly, chin up, eyes narrowed. "You do understand what chain of command means, don't you?" From the sidelines, that retired British colonel breathed out through his nose, muttering just loud enough, "Now he's done it. That's a clear breach." Several tourists instinctively reached for their phones, then hesitated. The whole scene had become tense in a way that felt almost serious, and suddenly nobody wanted to spoil it by filming. Vance's voice dropped low, the words meant to sound threatening. "Where I come from, disobeying a senior officer gets you told off. Or worse." Atkins's response was nothing, but somehow that nothing carried more weight than any shouted reply ever could. He hadn't saluted, he hadn't flinched, and yet, in his own way, he'd answered, just not in any way Vance understood. The American group had stopped further down the path, now watching this display with tight jaws and carefully blank faces. Even Vance's own assistants were looking clearly uncomfortable. The moment had stretched as far as it could go, and all eyes were fixed on the man who hadn't moved an inch. The change was tiny, so tiny that if you blinked, you might have missed it. But to everyone watching, it hit like a clap of thunder. Lance Corporal Tom Atkins moved. Not a twitch, not a flinch. This was a deliberate, careful, precise action. His white-gloved left hand rose, calm, controlled, methodical. And with one smooth movement, he removed J.D. Vance's arm from where it was hovering far too close to his rifle. The movement wasn't aggressive. It wasn't angry. It was just final. The crowd gasped as one. You could actually hear it. Then came the voice, firm, low, polished, like ceremonial steel. "Sir," Atkins said, eyes still locked forward in that perfect ceremonial gaze, "you are in direct violation of Standing Palace Protocol 2 Bravo regarding interference with ceremonial personnel." He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even raised his voice. But those words rang out across the courtyard like a drill sergeant's command. Vance actually blinked, thrown off for a moment, not just by the response itself, but by how clear it was. He'd been expecting silence. Or maybe politeness, not this. "Physical encroachment upon an armed ceremonial guard," Atkins continued, each word as precise as a surgeon's knife, "constitutes a security infraction. I must respectfully instruct you to return to the designated visitor's path." The words were clearly memorized, straight from military rules, but there was nothing robotic about how he said them. This was composed, unshakable, human. The veterans in the crowd straightened up instinctively, spines going stiff as if they were reacting to an old command. Vance tried to get back in control, squaring his shoulders. "So now British guards are lecturing senators?" Atkins's tone didn't change even slightly. "No, sir, I do not lecture. I carry out my duty. To the Crown." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Then from somewhere at the back, a single person started clapping. Then another. The applause was hesitant at first, like people weren't sure if it was okay. One elderly man just nodded silently, his eyes getting that shiny look of pride mixed with old memories. Vance opened his mouth to reply, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he took a step back. Just one. It wasn't an apology, but it was definitely a retreat. His face was still hard, still defiant. But something about his stance had changed. This meeting hadn't gone the way he'd planned. Somewhere, an American tourist whispered to her friend, "Wait, I thought they weren't allowed to talk." "They're not," replied a British local, speaking softly. "Unless someone crosses the line." Vance's assistants were now carefully moving towards their boss. One touched his elbow gently, murmuring, "Sir, We should probably rejoin the group." But Vance didn't move straight away. His eyes stayed locked, not on Atkins's eyes, which were still dutifully focused ahead, but on the man himself, like he was trying to work out what had just happened, trying to get back a moment that had already gone. Then came the final line. Atkins, already back in his perfect guard position, added with pinpoint accuracy, "This isn't America, Senator." The words were quiet, almost gentle, but everyone heard them. A few people actually broke into proper applause now. One British teenager whispered to his mate, "That was absolutely ice cold." Even the children seemed to sense that something important had just happened, something that wouldn't be in any tourist guide or explained on any palace tour. The silence returned, but this time it belonged completely to Atkins. Vance stepped back fully now, his jaw set in a hard line, lips pressed together. For all his importance, all his bluster, all his presence, he suddenly looked very, very small. And Tom Atkins. He was already back at perfect attention, as if the whole confrontation had been nothing more than a passing breeze. As if silence, once again, was the most powerful answer of all. Just as things got really tense, a new person appeared from a side entrance of the palace, moving with that sort of calm, deliberate way that immediately gets everyone's attention. Captain Sarah Jones, Palace Protocol Officer, a decorated logistics commander and someone who'd worked with NATO, looked impressive as she crossed the damp courtyard. She was tall with sharp features. Her uniform was so neat it looked like it could stand up by itself. Everything about her just screamed quiet, efficient, and totally unflappable British authority. "Senator Vance," she said calmly, not even slowing down as she approached, "if I may have a word." Vance turned, probably expecting her to be defensive, maybe even apologize. What he got instead was something much more effective, perfect politeness with a backbone of steel. "I understand there may have been some confusion about ceremonial protocol," she continued, making a gentle, sweeping gesture with an open hand that guided him a few steps away from the crowd. "It wasn't an order, but it was also very clearly not a suggestion you could ignore." Vance followed, trying hard to look calm, though his assistants were trailing him like nervous puppies. Captain Jones didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a big scene. Instead, she spoke with that crisp exactness of someone who's dealt with far worse situations behind closed doors at NATO. "Palace guards are sworn to the crown," she explained, her tone chatty but firm. "Their authority, while on duty, is higher than that of all visiting people, including elected officials from friendly nations." She paused just long enough to let that sink in, then added with perfect timing, "including senators." You could actually see Vance's eyebrows twitch. "Lance Corporal Atkins," she went on, nodding back towards the still motionless guard, "is not just a ceremonial figure. He's a combat-decorated infantryman. His last tour was a tough one overseas. Before that, he was in joint operations with US Marines, working alongside your forces. He's got a Bronze Service Star, mentioned in reports twice. Several of your American commanders have described him as unshakable under fire." She let those words land before making her final point. "He's not ignoring you, Senator. He's protecting you by keeping the discipline of his post." Vance's jaw worked silently as he took in this new information. A second person approached. Brigadier James Smith, commander of the Household Division. His uniform had fewer medals than Vance's, but there was something in his eyes, that quiet authority from decades of real service, that demanded immediate respect. "Senator," Brigadier Smith said with formal politeness, "these guards aren't actors in fancy dress. They're combat soldiers trained to switch smoothly between battlefield conditions and ceremonial duty without missing a beat. That kind of ability demands more than just being tough. It requires principle." Vance's voice, when it finally came, was noticeably quieter. In the US, soldiers salute elected leaders. It's basic chain of command. Captain Jones nodded, acknowledging his point. And in the UK, soldiers on ceremonial duty do not break formation for any reason unless there's an immediate threat or a direct breach of rules. Saluting an interfering civilian, even one in a high position, would itself be a breach of protocol. Brigadier Smith added, his tone measured. What might look like stubborn silence is actually one of the highest forms of professional discipline we ask of our service members. He remained calm, measured, and respectful, even when deliberately provoked. Behind them, the crowd was starting to slowly move off, the incident already turning into whispered chats and shared looks. A few people stayed, still watching Atkins, whose perfect stillness had returned as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Captain Jones softened her tone just a bit. These moments are easily misunderstood, Senator. Many visitors make similar assumptions, but there's a reason these men are trusted to represent the crown in front of millions. Vance breathed out slowly. He didn't apologize. His pride wouldn't let him. But he didn't push things any further either. Something had changed. Whether it was understanding, embarrassment, or just a political calculation wasn't entirely clear. But he nodded just once, then turned and started walking back towards his group, deliberately a few steps behind his assistants. And behind him, the British officers remained still, watching, steady and silent, like the red-coated guard in the courtyard. The rain had softened to an almost invisible mist now, the kind that clings to coats and makes everything look a bit soft around the edges. The American group had gathered again near the palace gates, their official cars waiting quietly behind the neat hedge. J.D. Vance stood slightly away from the others, saying little, his jaw still set in that defensive way of someone who knows they've made a mistake. He glanced back over his shoulder just once. Across the courtyard, Lance Corporal Tom Atkins was still exactly where he'd been all along, unmoved, unshaken. That red figure standing against the grey stone looked like something carved from British military tradition itself. His rifle rested at precisely the same angle, his gaze fixed at that constant 45 degrees, not looking at anyone in particular, and yet somehow taking everything in. Vance paused. Something about that steady stillness made him look again. Near the rope barrier, a small group of British veterans had stayed behind. One of them, a distinguished-looking older man in a navy blazer, his chest covered with campaign medals that told of long service, stepped forward without any fuss. He approached Atkins's position respectfully, stopping just beyond the barrier, keeping that careful distance that showed he understood the rules. Then, slowly, deliberately, he raised his weathered hand and gave a crisp, textbook-perfect salute. Atkins didn't respond. He didn't move. But the gesture didn't need a reply. It wasn't about getting something back. Another man followed, younger, possibly ex-military himself, offering the same silent mark of respect. Then, in what might have been the most surprising moment of all, one of the American security team, an older Marine, judging by his posture, exchanged a knowing look with a colleague, stepped forward, and added his own salute to the quiet ceremony. One by one, others joined in, not as a protest, not in defiance, just in recognition of something that goes beyond national borders, a soldier's respect for another soldier's discipline. Vance watched all of this happen. He didn't speak. For once, he seemed to understand this wasn't his moment to fill with words. His assistants shifted uncomfortably, but nobody rushed him. This wasn't the kind of scene you interrupt. Atkins kept his post, unchanging. There were no speeches, no formal apologies, no social media moments. Just silence. And somehow, in that silence, more was said than in all the words that came before it. Finally, Vance turned away, moving towards the waiting car. He pulled open the door himself, not waiting for anyone to do it for him. and got inside. The door closed with that expensive, muffled sound of important transport. The line of cars began to pull away, its tail lights reflecting briefly in the palace windows like fading embers. And still there, on the old stones of Buckingham Palace's courtyard, stood a single guard in red, unmoved by ceremony, unshaken by ego, his silence making a statement louder than any salute ever could. Do you reckon J.D. Vance should have got a salute, or did he get exactly what he deserved? And here's a bigger question. How should visitors from other countries act when they come across traditions that aren't their own? Pop your thoughts in the comments below. We really do read every single one. If this story struck a chord with you, if it made you think differently about respect and tradition, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tap that notification bell so you never miss what's coming up. Know someone who needs to see this. Someone who could use a reminder about respect. Share it with them. And hey, if you fancy more powerful moments just like this one, check out the other videos popping up on your screen right now. We'll see you next time, with another story that proves one simple truth. Respect isn't about rank, it's about knowing when to be quiet.